theme of today's event is around improving performance of NGOs, economic models for sustainable superior performance for NGOs. And so this particular edition, we have the lovely Claire with us. And so Claire is Vice President and Chief Program Officer of Salzburg Global Seminar. She is responsible for multi-year program strategy, design and partnerships, and implementation in Salzburg and around the world. So I will hand over to Prof to do the full introductions. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you all so much and welcome. I'm not going to make plenty of ado about something instead of nothing. But really, I think that it is such an honor and such a privilege. I'm sure many of you, when you hear Claire, the first Claire that you think of is short. But I think this is a better Claire. No, but really, it is a great pleasure to have you come out here. I think instead of going through a lot of talk about the Salzburg Global Seminar, I'll let you start out talking about that some. But just to say that all of us want to change the world. Plenty of us talk about changing the world. A few actually really truly do something about changing the world. Claire comes from a tradition of really doing something to change the world. In terms of shared knowledge, in terms of shared experiences of people. I have had the good fortune of being at the Salzburg Global Seminar myself. So I think it's an appropriate starting point to ask her to tell us what they do and then go into some of the models of how we could be more effective at changing the world. But I'd like her to start out with all of us being disposed to understanding that no matter how tough it seems, no matter how difficult it looks, we really can change this world. And as those famous words that follow us around from Margaret Mead, you know, remind us, if you determine individuals can change this world. Indeed, it's the only way the world has changed. Those few determined individuals. And I hope that our visit with us will help us to become one of those few, one of those determined. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Prof. It's an honor to be with you today. It's also such a pleasure because this is my very first trip to Nigeria. And it's, of course, rather a busy week for your country.
Possibly live in this world and not have Nigeria. Can you imagine?
But isn't that a great first trip to Nigeria, that I come and I see such a lovely group of people? I've also arrived at a busy time for your nation. So I particularly appreciate that you have all made the time to come here today during this week of elections and much volatility. So perhaps I should also say a very quick word about myself before I go into talking about the work we do in our organization. I have worn many different hats. So even listening to the way that you introduced yourselves, I hear so much experience and engagement in society, whether you are lawyers, running foundations, coming from the business world and so on, and having a group that is so diverse together is already a fantastic asset. So for myself, I originally came from the UK, but I'm also from Ireland. But I have lived outside the UK in Europe for nearly 30 years now. And my background has included work in business, work in law as a barrister in public interest litigation. And then since 1990, I specialized in international environment and sustainable development policy. And so many of the issues that are so important for Nigeria's future, the issue of water, of resources, of good health, good education, are things that I have worked on before my present job. Having worked all over the world around the issues of sustainable development and building safe and inclusive societies around the world. In 2012, I joined my organization, Salzburg Global Seminar. Very briefly, we are a non-profit that was created by young people at the end of the Second World War. So at the end of the Second World War, governments in America and Europe focused on how you rebuild divided societies. And we look out at the world today and we see many divided societies for many different reasons. At that point, Europe was completely divided, and many young people because of the war, had no opportunity to pursue their educations or to talk in peace to people living just across the other side of the border. And these three young men, one of whom was a refugee, met at Harvard, and they looked at governments who were creating the Marshall Plan for the economies, to rebuild the economies of Europe. And they said, we need a Marshall Plan of the mind. Do you mind if I stand up? It's easier to sort of move around. Sorry. I suddenly realized it felt a bit, I'm looking at the front row, but I can't see the back row. And they thought that it was very important to try to provide the conditions where young people, who will be the architects of their societies of the future, could meet on equal terms, safely, to try to shape the way the society would develop. And so in 1947, my organization was born. And the reason that we are in Austria and in a very beautiful building, but a difficult building to look after, is because when the Nazi soldiers, at the end of the war, when the Nazi soldiers left Austria, this beautiful castle where we are based had been the home of a great theatre producer who was Jewish and who had to escape from Hitler. And he died in exile during the Second World War. And his widow so liked the idea of these young people to create this Marshall Plan of the mind that she offered this beautiful facility to be our home. And indeed, that is why we have always been in Salzburg. Now, there aren't many non-profits around the world that have the joy and the problem of looking after a very expensive piece of world heritage. So I will come on to that later, but as Prof said, it actually causes us lots of challenges in terms of thinking about being entrepreneurial for ourselves. I'll come back to that in a moment. So where we stand now, for over 70 years, we have worked mainly from our headquarters in Austria to be a strategic convener, bringing current and future leaders together around the great challenges of our time. And as Prof said, our mission now is to challenge current and future leaders to shape a better world. And in those 70 years, we've had nearly 40,000 people have come together through our programs from over 170 countries. And I'm very proud that many great Nigerians are counted in that number. And we have fellows, yes. And we have fellows right across Africa. Prof also talked about the famous words of Margaret Mead, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Well, Margaret Mead was the very first chair of the very first Salzburg seminar in American Studies. I'm proud we had a woman, and it was her recommendation that said, this great thing that happened in 1947 should not stop. There is a need in this complex world to create the conditions where trust and openness can flourish. Now, I'll stop in one moment, but just to fast forward from 1947 to 2019, when we look out at the world today, whichever part of the world you're in, we see the strains on our societies and the particular problems that many of the young generation are facing. And I know that the issue of youth futures, of youth leadership, of youth employment is a massive issue for what is going to be the world's third most populous nation. And for those reasons, for me to come here today is an incredibly precious chance to learn from you about preoccupations and so on. I don't want to do all the talking, so I don't know whether you would like me to pass straight back to you, Prof, for another question. You just tell.
Yes,
give me my orders.
Well, thank you so very much. It's a good thing for most of us to get know a little bit more about the Salzburg Global Seminar. But, you know, we live in a very peculiar time in human history. I've just been reading Joshua Green's remarkable book, Moral Tribes. in looking at the divisions in the world, we versus them, me versus us, and so on, and so forth. In all of this, we live in a world where a couple of brilliant, smart, entrepreneurial techies now own almost 80% of the wealth of the planet. And they mean well, they've created a lot of value, they've created plenty of jobs, and the world needs them. But we also live in a world in which deprivation has been growing remarkably. So it seems to me clearly that there's a very, very important role for social enterprise to help bridge some of these cleavages, literally speaking, that are building up around the world. What models of social enterprise do you think may be more appealing for people who really want to take Margaret Mead's counsel about a few thoughtful, determined individuals actually really doing something to change that world?
Sure. I'm going to stand up again unless people get fed up with the sight of me. It keeps me on my toes. What you just described is this incredible imbalance of power that we see around the world, whether the power of the big tech companies compared with nation states, the power of the people in the bottom billion who are trying to think how can they shape different decent life chances and move each generation forward. And globally, we have through the United Nations, there is now these global goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, and there's been a lot of thought about how much money needs to flow for global society to achieve those Sustainable Development Goals. My starting point is that business as usual, relying on overseas development assistance or conventional philanthropy, whilst important, cannot be enough for the dynamism of emerging countries and continents that have incredible innovation potential, and that we need to be thinking about how finance and capital can be aligned to flow towards achieving those goals using different and diverse financial models. So if I stop and give a couple of examples of our own journey as an institution, and very much throwing it out, you know, and if people want to ask questions, please just jump in. So we, for, I would say, over 65 years of our 72-year history, were pretty much business as usual in terms of how we really relied on conventional philanthropy. I don't mean we were lazy. It's hard work, as I bet lots of people know here, to get grants from philanthropic foundations. But we were mainly reliant on charitable donations and fundraising. And historically, a lot of that money came from the United States because our original founding was, of course, as to help bring peace back across the Atlantic and within Europe. But in 2007, 2008, some big external shocks happened which really rocked our organization. And this was before my time. I joined as number 2 as vice president in 2012. The first of those big tectonic shifts was, I'll call it geopolitical. So Austria, which is where we're based, historically was on the edge of Western Europe in terms of the formation of the European Union. The Iron Curtain was right on its eastern border, so the communist regimes pretty much came up to our back door. And obviously, as the European Union has expanded, as the Iron Curtain came down, as liberal democracy took root in Eastern Europe, the relevance, the strategic location of where we were started to change, because more countries, thank goodness, started to be able to have more democratic political systems, their economies began to change, new money went into those countries. But for us, we were no longer quite as central and as pivotal geographically as we once had been. And that also impacted some of the way that we did our programming, because as a safe space on the edge of democratic Europe, we were a natural place where many programs came. We worked, for example, with the higher education institutions as they came out of the communist regime, building capacity with leaders of universities and so on. So it's healthy that that change happened. It's fantastic when countries are able to assume their own destinies and shake off oppressive regimes. But it meant that there was a rethink for geopolitical reasons. The second external shock, and this was much more radical and difficult for us, was the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. And what happened with that was a real decline in philanthropic investments in Europe. We had austerity regimes, which we still see in some European countries. I know it's relative. They're still very rich in comparison. But nonetheless, available public budgets and philanthropic budgets took a big haircut. And that meant we have some endowment. And, you know, we can only dream of the kind of endowments that big American universities have. And as I said, we have a very expensive headquarters because it's a historic property for which we have a stewardship responsibility. But our endowment took a very big hit. We had investment losses of around $6 million. That's an awful lot. And the third part of the financial problem was that the exchange rate between the dollar and euros also took a hit. And historically, most of our philanthropic revenue and our individual donations came from the United States, partly because that's really where the concentration of big foundations is located. And so for all those reasons, we had to really rely on changes. And the one I wanted to focus on was what has been happening over the last 4 to 5 years, which is really a total transformation of our business model. And I'll talk about this in more detail, but I want to highlight straight away that we could not have done what we've done without a really engaged board. You need champions on your board or in your community who believe in what you do, who can share their vision, and hopefully who can make some of their expertise and their financial know-how available. That really mattered a lot to us, because I have a team of people who are brilliant. They're fantastic people, but they're brilliant around global health challenges or transforming education or human rights and human dignity. But many of them are not business people. And so our board played a very important complementary role for us. So the big question we had to ask was, are our two beautiful buildings, and one is 300 years old and one is 400 years old, and they're big, are they a nightmare liability, or can we turn them into something which isn't just beautiful, but becomes a true asset that we leverage? Now, historically, we had had external clients. When we weren't hosting our residential programs for public interest work, we had had external clients, and we used to call it, before my time, conference center, which was very unlovely as a term. It wasn't exciting. The people who worked there, they were great, but they were self-taught. It wasn't professionalized. And what we did with our board was to think about how can we affordably invest in our assets. So what we developed was an impact investing scheme, which basically we needed to raise money to renovate our property without going to increase our commercial debt. I mentioned an endowment. Well, we also have debt because we have had in the 2000s to invest to protect the building from sinking down in the water. So, you know, we juggle with quite big figures, but we are far from being rich as an institution. So with the impact investing scheme, that consisted of low interest loans at 1.5% with a 3-year grace period, but it was backed by philanthropic investors. So they were not making a grant, but they were backing the loans that were made at this low interest rate by some board members, by friends of our organization, and so on. And we used that to convert our facilities into a hotel. So we already had the bedrooms. We had 55 bedrooms in the Meyerhof, which is 400 years old, and we had 12 suites in our Schloss, our beautiful palace that Prof and Francis know. But they were dusty. I mean, it sounds ungrateful, but the fact is, you know, it was old and it was beautiful, but it didn't have the kind of facilities that the outside world has come to expect. I mean, you know, people need really great Wi-Fi. They don't always get it, but they need it. And if they don't get it, they may not come back. So we had to look at, in the cold light of day, about what would change the business around. And so we created the brand and the reality of Hotel Schloss Leopoldskron. Schloss means palace or castle. So Leopoldskron is our name, so Hotel Schloss Leopoldskron. And it's been officially open since 2014. And I have to say, because I just heard on the news that the designer Karl Lagerfeld of Chanel has died today. And he was one of our very, very first clients. And he so loved the building that he came in 2014 and said, I want to do the big Chanel event here and celebrate your incredible heritage. So that, I mean, that was Christmas come early. Nobody could have expected that. And Chanel have very different budgets from our budgets, I can tell you that. And there is a funny story because they're such perfectionists that they wanted the heritage because they wanted a design collection around Austrian traditions. But Karl Lagerfeld himself never, ever, ever allows a sloppy detail to go unnoticed. So he wanted perfect curtains to hang in our beautiful marble hall. And as Prof knows, we are now, I think, the only non-profit in the world that has handmade silk curtains by Chanel given to us for free by Karl Lagerfeld. So when I leave you, I will certainly be posting a rather sad little tweet about Karl's death. But it's a nice story because what it does illustrate for me is that when you think as an entrepreneur in the way you seek to have impact, the way you seek to experiment with your business models, look for serendipity. There are always unexpected opportunities, and if you are nimble and see the connections, you can find mutual interest, which it worked for Chanel. They couldn't have had the same atmosphere anywhere else in the world, and it worked for us. So I'll carry on unless Pat interrupts me on this, because the model is fascinating. I already mentioned that the board was absolutely fundamental. And another lesson I learned is not to be shy. In your communities or your churches or your institutions or your companies, there are nearly always people who care about what you're trying to achieve in your work and who will be happy on a pro bono basis to share what they've learned. They may, just as they may be happy to be your mentor on a private basis, they may also be happy to share ideas or lessons or things to avoid just because it's no skin off their nose. People want to see their societies move forward and they want a better deal for next generations. We also had a long-term institutional partner, capital group companies, and that group, which has funded many scholarships very generously in our history, gave its expertise pro bono to help us manage, for example, the exchange rate risk exposure and to help us think about long-term financial sustainability. Because we needed, for example, to find short-term money to support professional hotel consultants because it was new to us and so on. So that was what we did. And I'll give you an example of some of the results we've had. But then if Pat allows, I will also talk a bit about some of the headaches and the hiccups that caused internally, including for me with my team. Because I think talking openly about stuff that's harder than you think is really important. So the hotel has been open for 5 years with a fantastic team. And the revenue contribution that the hotel now makes to our non-profit operation, it was about 10% before we set up the hotel, and it's now about 35% of our bottom line since we renovated the hotel. But the benefits to us have gone much further than just that percentage, because most of the hotel's revenue is in euros. So whereas a lot of our philanthropic grants or our fundraising for the programs, which are my responsibility, comes in dollars, not all, but quite a lot, we have a more stable source of revenue without currency fluctuations on the hotel's side. But what's also happened is that we as a team have really gained a lot of experience in how you can align and integrate two different types of operations within a single business. At the beginning, trying myself to be very much a team member, I would talk about one organization, two businesses. And I meant that in a federating way, in a supportive way. Now we don't say that. We now say one business. We really have had a mindset shift in the way we think about the mutual support. And maybe I'll give an example of how that journey took a bit of getting to. So I'm sure for those of you who work in social change, quite understandably, you feel, and I'm saying this quite neutrally, you feel you're on the side of the angels. You want to make life better. You want to improve your communities, your world. But sometimes you may not know how to talk the language of business. And my program directors and myself and others, great people, but it wasn't so comfortable. And what happened at the beginning was that we had to navigate a learning curve with our teams so that the disciplines that people had to learn about were not seen as imposed, as hostile, and so on. But for some people who'd been in our team for a very long time, they were saying, you know, we're going to have to pay penalty clauses if we cancel a program because the hotel's lost revenue. This is changing the very nature of what we do. And I think that I had to learn. I tried at the beginning saying, the hotel is your best friend. And I'm quite sure that when I wasn't in the room, a fair few people said, you know, what is she on about? But my conviction from the beginning, and of course I'm not alone, I have fantastic colleagues, was that getting smart about the for-profit thinking alongside the public interest mission is really, really helpful. Because what it allows you to do is then to find all kinds of ways that you talk better with business, mainstream business, with different types of social enterprise, with investors, perhaps with real estate community. All kinds of people are easier to talk to when you show that you understand the leverage potential of money, when you have a smarter understanding of the bottom line. But it was a journey for us, and I don't pretend that there weren't at times misunderstandings. If I put my hotel hat on, you need to try and think every day of the year, every hour of the day, how can I get in more clients? So when you have the program people who are saying, we've got this really difficult program, we've got refugees and people who are dealing on the front line with human rights or abuses or corruption coming in, we need space, we need quiet, we need peace. You can imagine that there was a little bit of communication that had to happen. If we tried to block days 10 months in advance for very busy leaders, and then the hotel said, hey, we've got a most amazing client who wants those days only, we sometimes had conflict. And I'm sure lots of you know this thing, you know, managing conflict inside your organizations or put more positively, managing for change within your organization. It's one of the most exciting, but also one of the most important things you can do. And in that sense, I think building trust within teams for change has been really essential. The kind of things the disciplines we've had to learn, and I know this is specific to us, for example, is that we try to keep our summer as free as possible from programs, because people want to get married in our Schloss. They want to come in and have, nice summer holidays, and the hotel can charge them more money. But we market that now, and for our hotel guests, we show them that when they come and spend money at the hotel, then some of that money goes to support an organization which is dedicated to shaping a better world. And sometimes it's just beginning, but we now sometimes have hotel guests who are saying, can I contribute to your mission? And even people who come in for a romantic anniversary weekend, who then say, I've been wondering where to take my corporate retreat or my board meeting, and I like the idea of your values. And here we are in CVL, which is all about values in public life and for Nigeria's future. And so it's very appealing to me when you have that values base and you make it apparent even to the commercial client base. A couple of other comments. By doing this big, bold leap, we have seen really concrete benefits in terms of our fundraising with partners and with donors. So for our partners and our program participants, as I said before, yes, the place was beautiful, but the rooms were really, really, really not beautiful. And now that all the rooms are of a decent standard, we've been able to design completely new kinds of programs because, for example, we can bring in the heads of the world's financial system because nobody's left, having to walk down the corridor to get to the loo. It's quite important. It's also for donors been really effective for one simple reason. When a donor sees that the beneficiary, the grantee, is itself being very entrepreneurial, the donor gets interested. So philanthropic foundations are themselves thinking about how they're going to change their operations over the decades to come. And when they see an applicant that is being really imaginative and entrepreneurial, they pick up the phone. And that has actually been even more impactful than I perhaps had expected. What has happened by having a combined business model is that we're actually better able to defray quite a lot of our operating costs differently. So the hotel revenue now covers some of the expenses that the non-profit used to have to pay for. So things like the hotel staff salaries, because the people who cook for hotel guests are the same people who cook for our participants when they come into our programs. Food and beverages, services costs, keeping up the building, maintaining the facilities. The non-profit business is still covering program and executive salaries, the costs of our fundraisers, our financial team, that kind of thing. And the non-profit is still covering about 65% of our total bottom line. And we do that through the endowment revenue, charitable contributions, grants and sponsorships. I can finish with a stat and then maybe if you want to jump in. Yeah? Because I don't want to... Yeah. I'll let Pat go jump in.
Well, perhaps what I should do is just raise one or two more questions, and you've covered plenty of the territory. And then we can take questions from our audience here. You talk about those who think they are on the side of the angels, and those who think that the other side is full of evil, greedy people. Now, this us-them thing is one of the big challenges with non-profits sometimes getting the support that they could and should get. Clearly, there are challenges of building models of cooperation, coexistence between enterprise. I come from both a commercial background and all of that, and I see this tension even in the board of a company The way that the marketing person argues some issues that's different from the finance person can be so strong in a particular way that you think they don't work for the same company. Now, any lessons to share about how we build this understanding that it's important for there to be commerce, and the commerce moves the world far forward, and that the people in commerce, they maybe focus, almost obsessively on their goal in commerce, which often looks like just the bottom line, the single bottom line. However, they recognize that if the world does not really get along, all their commercial ambitions will be lost. How do we, as players, facilitate this understanding, this cooperation, the coexistence that leads to the mutual benefit of all in making the world better?
It's a great question, and it's a really challenging one. I think we have an incredible window of opportunity right now. I mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, which, the UN goals to 2030. For the first time, those goals apply to all stakeholders in society, not just governments. It's not old style. What I'm seeing, even since the goals were adopted in 2015, is more and more interest in corporations, including big multinationals, about how are they going to show themselves as first in class for delivering against the goals that are relevant to what they do. So I think the conversation is changing now around the boardroom, and I worked in business, so I totally am not at Pat's level, but I totally understand that issue where each director has to compete. But I think there are two things. One is, at the high level, the Sustainable Development Goals are very different from the Millennium Development Goals, and I am seeing a buy-in which is gathering pace, and the fact that it's good colourful logos, it's a very, very different world, and I'm hearing a lot more talk within companies about that. So the days when it was just corporate social responsibility over there are a little changed. A driver of that is obviously that any smart company has to be thinking about its resource use, its risks to its operating models, opportunities to save money by being more sustainable in the way it produces and consumes, it deals with climate emissions and so on. So there is a technological and an economic logic for corporations and businesses to become smarter in terms of their social and environmental footprint. But there are also standards that are shifting. And so in terms of environmental and social governance, we have a program every year for leaders in corporate governance. And at the beginning, frankly, it was sort of a little bit, older men in suits, mainly from North America. And in 5 years, we've reached gender parity. And one of our co-chairs is a woman who is one of the leaders in looking at environmental and social governance and how corporations are going to be, what will be the expectations for businesses. So that's changing. And then the other thing that's changing is, of course, next gen. Next generation are looking at more than just a pay packet. I'm not being naive. We all need to try and have a roof and feed our kids and all the rest of it. But at the same time, we're seeing upwards pressure in terms of the recruitment and expectations coming in. So those are things that are influences within the board and in the behaviors of enlightened companies. And my own feeling is that the smart companies now are thinking hard about the fact that given that their performance is very visible, social media can look and can track what they do, they have a vested interest, in the good sense of vested interest, in trying to think about responsibility in that way. I don't mean that, we know about corruption and so on and so forth, but I think that the direction of travel and the attention that can be given to that improved performance is a very positive trend that can be harnessed. Coming back then to the question of how the non-profit connects to that, I think, again, doing research, looking at the kinds of businesses in your community or your country that are showing an interest through their corporate foundation or through activities of their leaders, and seeing where the synergies or the convergence can be found can make a lot of sense in that way. What we are seeing in the work we do around philanthropy and social investment is that there's a new openness globally to talking about what isn't working very well in conventional philanthropy and understanding that social and impact investing is really one of the big ways of the future. And so, for example, the big philanthropic foundations came to us, 5 of them, including the Ford Foundation, to say, we need to rethink what we do because we need to think about talent management, about diversity. Do we employ the people who represent the communities that we say we seek to help? Because there was a trust barrier. And so we started working around the future of philanthropy and the issue of talent management. At the same time, we're seeing fantastic new networks taking shape, like the Africa Venture Philanthropy Alliance. And I met with the colleagues over in Nairobi just last week, where there was a real interest in what could be the role of some of the corporate foundations that are really taking shape in Africa, and how could they be first in class in this area. So I think understanding the landscape and being able to see how to have a different pitch, to communicate strategically with a focus on impact, what you do, but to people who do talk the language of business, doesn't have to be hostile to the impact goal.
I like the models described. Right. Now, what came to my mind was, what's the taxation policy in Austria? Because we have a small hotel in our facility, and the tax people came calling that we have to pay tax, that we're running a business and we're making money, so we have to pay tax. We tried to get them to understand that this facility was set up with donor funding, and it is supposed to make equitable contribution to running the non-profit operations, but that did not break any ice. So what's the situation in Austria, and how do you handle it?
That is owned by one part, I guess the biggest NGO in the world, BRIC. I don't know how many of us know the story of BRIC, Bangladesh Rural Investment Committee. This gentleman who left his job at Shell in the UK in the 60s, sold his house in London and invested it in this NGO. That is a remarkable NGO, owns universities, factories, all kinds. And the head office is in a 10-story building in a country as poor as Bangladesh. Has matter. Okay.
Sure, I may not have facts and figures in the full thing. It is a balancing act, is the answer. We can, I would have to check the exact percentage, but basically we had the tax lawyers all over this, as you can imagine, and we are able to earn up to a certain amount without compromising our non-profit status. But that is very, very carefully monitored in obviously complete transparency, but it can be done. The Austrian model will allow us to do that up to a certain threshold. If it started to look as if we were doing essentially all for-profit activities under the cloak of a non-profit, then they would very quickly find out about it. So the kind of times when that may come up is when we think, do we start to do more executive education courses, you know, beyond a certain amount for very, very high amounts? We still have some latitude, and we obviously are keen to keep on diversifying and so on, but we can't, there are limits imposed by the tax. As Pat asked about the tax policy issues, it's a challenging issue because you can often have what we call perverse incentives. When you have a tax reform in one part of society, it can bite you back. So, for example, in France, you may have seen there's been a lot of rioting and unrest in France recently, and part of that linked to a change in the wealth tax, where the president wanted to encourage people to invest in stocks and shares and so on. And what's happened by reducing that, apparently people have put more money into their stocks and shares, and they've ceased to put so much investment in philanthropic foundations which have the tax benefits. So it's a very difficult balancing act.
I run an NGO, and it's a non-profit one that is mainly for gender parity. But the challenge here is, how do you break the wall of mistrust in a situation where you're going to run an NGO that is not profit and you desire to have sponsors? And I have it as a challenge here in this part of the world where you need people to come in and donate to the help of maybe the less privileged and run activities like mentorship activities. So I want to know, what are the strategies that one can put in to break the wall? Thank you.
So the excellent question was around how do you break the wall of mistrust when you're trying to bring in donations and sponsors from outside, particularly where it's a sensitive topic like, or it could be, with gender parity and so on. Obviously, I don't know the details of the Nigerian context, but we also have faced the issue. I think the first point is being absolutely clear that if you have money coming in from businesses and corporate interests, that you do not have corporate capture of what you're doing. And I do not mean that cynically against business. I mean it completely neutrally. So, for example, we have annual programs. I mentioned corporate governance. I mentioned finance. We have a new program on law and technology starting up. And we go out to find private sector supporters for that because we want to improve our long-term financial sustainability. So we find ourselves in deep waters in terms of some people saying, well, if so-and-so's there, I won't come, and all this kind of thing. And we, in that case, we hold on to our mission and our values as an organization to say there's no corporate capture in that way. So I think transparency, including in the way you negotiate the partnerships, can be very helpful. But I think that one can flip that lens and also do it in a positive way to say that X or Y company that seeks to support gender parity is also being forward-looking in terms of the needs and expectations of its own workforce and the society of tomorrow. And that there is a way of framing it that plays to what I would call the enlightened self-interest of both parties. I'm a huge believer in the for-profit. We can't change societies without absolutely galvanizing and catalyzing the power of business to drive society forward. For me, it's absolutely fundamental. But I think that the non-profit and impact investing sector can truly help business by helping to think smart about the mutual interest, because in the end, the goals of many non-profits directly feed into a happier or more stable or more cohesive workforce or a more competitive society. If you're working around health and housing for younger people, well, you're going to have a better workforce and your country will be more competitive. So I think there's a way of framing that reduces the threat level, perhaps a little.
With no further questions, I'll ask the last one. We can see the evolution of strategic philanthropy and how closely it aligns with how wealth has grown in the world. With American capitalism's rise after World War II, most of the concentration of capital was in the United States of America, and that played out in the story of the Salzburg Global Seminar and it evolved. Now, we've seen a lot of wealth shift to Asia in more recent times. You were talking about 2008, and I thought I was in Asia during the financial crisis of 1997, 98. And a lot of people were getting rich, and then suddenly they became poor. And they joke about the market for those who used to be millionaires in Bangkok and all of that. But Asia has come in a big surge, and now they're very wealthy people in Asia trying to make a difference with the money that they have. And we've seen the rise of the Asian Philanthropy Association as part of a support base for that. Now, there's an emerging wealthy class now in Africa. It's a small portion, but they're emerging. But they're not quite clear yet how to do good with the money that they're making. Some of them are on ego trips, about they're wanting to do good. people here, some of the people who will be going to talk to some of those people, any counsel on how to begin to prepare those people to truly build sustainable legacies? I mean, when Henry Ford set up the trust and the Ford Foundation, obviously he couldn't have seen today and the kind of impact that that foundation would have through generations. How can these people who will talk to some of these emerging centers of wealth in Africa about strategic philanthropy approach those people and engage them?
Yeah, another great question. I think that these networks of learning and expertise are incredibly valuable in that way. The fact that Africa, and Pat is helping, has now created the Africa Venture Philanthropy Alliance, can and I hope should be a first port of call for people who seek to have this legacy and who have that high net worth that really could enable them to have a difference, to be able to think collaboratively about the kinds of systems challenges where they can direct their spending is very important. In my experience, having the clarity, I'm imagining I have lots of money here through a foundation or as an individual. I think having real clarity about what it is you seek to achieve, what is the change that you want to see, and thinking about impact is obviously the first step. Everything we do is cross-sector and looking at systems transformation. It's easier to, for example, put money into something which has a quick quantitative sort of target. I'm being, 60,000 toilets in this high density occupation or whatever. Very important for the people who live there. But having an understanding that if you're looking at real legacy change, then thinking about the underlying issues that need to be resolved to get a true return on that investment is very important. So to come back to your question about gender, there is a risk that if one focuses on the quick win, and I'm not being cheap here, but vaccinations, toilets, whatever, without looking at underlying things that are proven to have a longer benefit for society, like women's economic empowerment is one of the issues, then you won't get such a sustainable legacy. So I think also, and this is not it is self-interest, but it's enlightened. I think for those in your networks who find themselves in that position of potentially playing a very influential role in the shaping of your societies going forward, we are very, very interested in connecting and talking with them, because the work we do around health systems transformation, about really thinking about schools of tomorrow and the role of technology as a transformer. We have worked with brilliant Africans from many countries, but sometimes those great stories or those low-hanging fruit for great investments are not as well known as they might be. So the sharing of information on equal terms in conditions of trust can, I think, be really helpful. And we certainly are really looking forward to those kind of conversations.
Thank you so very much. Well, thank you for being a remarkable audience. After the bell. Okay. Well, we'll take your comment. Very quick one.
Thank you very much, sir. It's so wonderful to be here. I want to ask a quick question, because the NGOs in Nigeria will face very peculiar situations from the developed countries. Now, we have often faced government restrictions, rules and regulations that have been passed, policies to stifle the activities of NGOs. So my question is directed to the Prof himself, because he's in our system and you are in governance. So how do we galvanize as a body to approach government when they start bringing in policies that will stifle, the NGOs? Now, we try to fight an NGO bill that was supposed to have been passed in 2017. Now we're facing another one that has just passed the Senate hearing. So how do we cope with this as a body? Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a very hard but easy question. I mean, it's hard in the sense that it's a very complex, very nuanced subject. But it's easy because as a broad challenge for all of us that raises the need for enlightenment, education, of truly creating a public sphere, public conversation. I say, of course, I am a little audacious in these things. I say clearly that the biggest risk of doing business in Nigeria is regulatory risk. Government is the greatest danger to business in Nigeria. I say it all the time. Take any sector. In fact, as a consultant advising investors, the first thing I say to them is the sector you're looking at regulated. If it's regulated, you're in trouble already. So you begin to look at how you can manage your, yes, and because unfortunately, and this is where education is important and is needed, unfortunately, the way we think of power in our country is bullying. Any uniform that you wear gives you the right to bully anybody on your path. The policeman is that way, the customs official. You've seen the tape that went viral on the customs people shooting somebody. But it's the mindset of this culture until we can educate people to recognize that authority is about service and not about the ability to show that you can oppress. It will be a problem. And so we all have to keep working jointly to enlighten power and to create systems that really build institutions. Because what are institutions? Institutions are boundaries to conduct. If the boundaries to acceptable conduct don't exist, then you are in the jungle. And it will take work. It will take all of us hammering on radio, television, in classrooms, and all of that, until there's a better understanding. Then we'll make progress. But there isn't a quick fix. It takes persistent, consistent work of enlightening people. Yeah.
It was such an important question, and it's helpful for me as well to have that, brutal reminder, or that, of the realities on the ground. All I would add is that globally, not necessarily at the same level as here in Nigeria, but globally there is a phenomenon in many parts of the world about the shrinking space for civil society. And it's happening in different ways. Sometimes it's happening through the legislation, the regulatory pressures. Sometimes it's straight abuse of power and authority. It's also happening in the way that we're allowing our cities to be developed. The world is urbanizing, is an incredible rate of building. A lot of that building is privatized space. So the places where people, ordinary people, can just meet safely together in public space is shrinking around the world. And that is an issue that is being picked up in our programs by several foundations and so on. It's something to be alert for. And maybe coming back to talking to the wealthy, the newly wealthy in Africa, for them to actually think about the responsibilities of corporations and investors in this space, to think about what gave African communities this vibrancy, extended family, community, church, places where people could come together on equal terms. And if we privatize the physical space, then ordinary people are driven further and further away from places they can safely meet. And in just a quick comment on that, on the shrinking space for civil society, even in Europe, in the country of Hungary, the Open Societies Foundation, founded by George Soros, they've actually had to move the entire university he paid for out of the country because of the repression of the civil society operating freedoms. And we will be meeting with their leadership, and they're relocating to Austria. But if you had said to people when the Iron Curtain came down that freedoms they thought were acquired in rich Europe have been eaten back, taken away, there is now a reaction against that. People are waking up to the dangers. And so I would just wholeheartedly endorse what Pat said about use the media channels available to you safely to keep the spotlight on that and not allow the freedoms to be nibbled away at.
Thank you. Well, thank you all so much. Since Claire has been standing, maybe I should stand too. Finally, so I can see the back of the room. Quite a number of really interesting people. I hope that we have managed to get plenty out of what Claire Shine has to offer us. Her experience is tremendous, enormous, and she's very, very, very keen to help us in any way that she can. So thank you for coming, Claire. We truly appreciate you. We're glad that you have come. I think we can probably go outside, take a photograph or two, and then come back for cocktails inside here. Thank you. Welcome.